So this is a piece by Richard Long called "A Line Made by Walking" from 1967. And when I see this, I think about like what Long's experience was in making this piece, right? So he comes across this empty field, and he starts walking, and maybe he's trying not to be too self-conscious about it, but he wants to make a straight line, you know? And then the next time he's walking on the line, he's got that first walk in his head. You know, he's looking down, but there's still a little bit of indeterminism, what might happen. But by the last time he makes this walk, there's no doubt where the line is, right? He's established this. And not only for Richard Long, but any random person that might come across this line is going to end up following it, right? I mean, I kind of want to follow it, you know, looking at this image. And if they don't follow it, they're doing it because of some circumstance or some intention, some reason. There's some necessary relation between their experience and what this line has laid out. So in a sense, the line has kind of left Long behind, right, and become a structuring agent in its own right. So it's a protocol, it's an interface, it's a piece of culture, so to speak, that's reinforcing itself until it dissolves into something else entirely. And this is a beautiful photograph, right? But it's also a document of that temporal structure, you know, which ends up being a model or a metaphor for all the patterned actions, you know, that we make in the course of going about our everyday lives. So, yeah, like Long, a lot of what I do attempts to take the metaphor kind of literally. Or rather, you know, I'm interested in these experiments that are intended to function, you know, both as some kind of novel mechanism and as a metaphor for everyday experience. So I thought I'd start with this piece, which is kind of a long-running and pretty half-baked research project. It comes from what I like to call my own private Idaho. You know, this type of project, you know, it's something that maybe doesn't result in something you present, but kind of informs the work that you do. And in any case, this is just accelerometer data from, you know, the iPhone that's always in my pocket. So you have just Euclidean amplitude over the 3 axes. And you can see, you know, it's available through the iOS JavaScript interface. I'm signal processing it with Python a little bit. And you can see the footsteps, right? I'm just extracting right foot, left foot, and the timing of that data. So I have it in my pocket, and I'm recording it just like Fitbit records it, or Nike Plus, or Feltron. And then I walk around. And when I'm walking, I listen to the timing of my footsteps from previous times that I've been walking around. You can turn that up a little bit. And so the rhythm of this past walk is imposed on the current one, right? And what you're hearing is just what I'm hearing in the headphones. So it's these beats, right, left, and I'm trying to match them. So the data was recorded in Providence, which was that first video. This one's in Brooklyn. It's the same thing. And I'm trying to match them or maybe not match them and establish some kind of relationship between those different cities or those different times or different people. So I've collected walks from friends, and I'll listen to theirs. I'll have them listen to mine, right? And the whole point of that is that it's kind of awkward, right? And I like awkward stuff and kind of half-baked stuff because it means there's something unresolved. There's something to be learned there. And so there's feedback in this process, right? The walks, they get corrupted and amalgamated and smoothed over and whatever because they are relations of different bodies encountering space in different ways and building a sort of strange consensus. And the data both captures that physicality in some sense, you know, that difference in individuality, and in another sense, the data totally denies it, right? So like Long's line, data can both express and it can structure quotidian performance. And I'm interested in exploring the details of how that happens. Just a couple series of experiments. This is called Tangler. It's kind of analogous to what you just saw, but it's online. And it's just a browser extension. And when you turn it on, it couples you with some anonymous stranger. So when you go to a URL, it takes them to the same URL and vice versa, right? So suddenly browsing is happening in time, and it's a social experience with the rhythm of your action matters, right? And the intention there is to reveal some kind of friction with how we normally act online, right? In this kind of weird perpetual now that we're sunk into when we're using a web browser. And this is still, I still consider this to be physical and embodied, right? You know, even if you're sitting at a laptop, you're sitting at a laptop. This one is another take on it that I just finished, another experiment called automatic browser. So this one creates a statistical model from your past behavior. It logs all the sites you visited and for how long. And then when you visit a site, it decides where and when you're likely to go next, and then it just takes you there. And so in a way, it's the same project as Tangler, but the ghost that you're negotiating with is your own past behavior, right, in the will of this algorithm. So I call it predictive browsing, and that's practically what Google is doing anyway, right? It's creating this little online impersonation of you. And another way I like to think of it is that as if your data has kind of shaken loose from you. And so that is also in play with this piece that I call Joyride, right? So my friend had her phone stolen, which is, a pretty traumatic experience in and of itself. But she happened to have this project called OpenPaths on it, which is recording her location data. And so the next day, we're sitting there and we're watching this thing move around on a map, right? It's her location data, except it suddenly become estranged from her, as a person. It's doing its own thing. And it was actually Jer and I had a brainstorm about what would be interesting to do in this situation. And I realized that I could determine the likely path between each latitude and longitude breadcrumb with the Google Directions API, which you're seeing here, although it goes on for pages and pages. And then I scraped all the Street View tiles along the way, and I stitched them together into this video. So it's kind of Google driving the getaway car, right? And I consider this kind of a kind of re-performance, right, of the thief's journey via Google's cars that had driven the route, months prior, right? So it comes together in this kind of Frankendata kind of thing. And it's hard to place exactly where this exists in time, right? And like which physical bodies are implicated here. This is fun because, the Google car was driving in the opposite direction, so then you get this backwards thing going on. Yeah. And that notion of data shaking loose and taking on its own sense of time also motivated this piece. So we call this eternal portraits. And it's kind of a stupidly simple thing. What's framed here is just the face recognition template data produced by Facebook for every profile, right? So it's the data to identify you in any photograph. And there was a brief period where this data was downloadable in raw form from your settings, buried in the free data thing. I don't know why they put it there to begin with, and I don't know why they took it away. But we managed to get 3 profiles down for 3 individuals. And that information is unusable without knowing exactly what's encoded and how it's encoded. But we began thinking of it as this irrevocable corporate byproduct, right? The future implications of this data being out there are unclear. Because in a sense, these templates are all possible photos of you, right? Taken and untaken. I mean, that wigs me out. Maybe you don't think that's interesting. But they defy the nostalgia of a single snapshot, right? They're anticipating the future. And again, these objects that start to take on, this different sense of time. And that warped time is in play whenever we think about so-called personal data, right? In whatever form it takes, whether it's corporations building an advertising profile on you, or individuals looking to hire you or to date you, or the NSA who's trying to figure out if you're a threat to the state, et cetera. And how the data is captured and encoded and stored matters, because this shit is haunted, right? And we see how it gets reanimated and acts back on daily life when it turns from being expressive to being structuring. So this is 2011 for me in New York City with data collected via OpenPaths. You know, and anytime you look at a map like this, you start to build narratives. So we can see, you know, I'm living in Brooklyn, and I like to bike over the bridge and up Hudson, you know, to work in Midtown at the times and like hang out in Greenpoint and whatever, right? So that narrative right there is both, it's both aesthetically interesting and economically valuable. But that narrative is also not on this map, right? It's something that's provided by my memory and the performance of interpretation, you know, as I speak to this data. And that's the thing with a map, right? So as Desserteau beautifully puts it here, it transforms the temporal articulation of places into a spatial sequence of points. A graph takes the place of an operation. A reversible sign is substituted for a practice indissociable from particular moments and opportunities. It is thus a mark in place of acts, a relic in place of performances. It is only their remainder, the sign of their erasure. And a map and a data set, in this sense, I think, are no different, right? It's a representation which can shape our worldview according to its strategies and fix the bounds of these potential narratives. But it's missing, as Ezra Pound would put it, the view in the midst of the voyage, right? The actual contingent experience of the journey. And so one way I started to think about what data scientists do, you know, and what artists might do, is to try to recreate that narrative time, right? To speak data. And the question is, how can I gather data like geospatial data, and then know something about a person's experience and their agency and their intent, and then aesthetically, can I use that to recreate or reinterpret or even generate a new subjective experience? So in other words, can I put the data back into time? And that's exactly what an advertiser wants to do, remember, right? So for example, to know how to insert themselves into your life, you know, right when you might be receptive to whatever they have to offer, right? To influence your pattern of behavior to resemble their interpretation of what your data means. And the NSA, of course, is pushing it further, right? Just like the state has always used maps to define the contours of its territory and to fix its performative potential. This is Melt Banana. So in thinking about the interplay between representation and lived experience, I wanted to explore what is maybe difficult for data visualization to convey, which is that process through which data is reperformed, which is how I like to call it. And so I naturally gravitated toward sonification, or really musification. And I'm making that distinction, you know, between sound and music, because it's not just sound I'm interested in, you know, as a phenomenon. It's everything that comes along with making music, right? The culture, the physical performance, the recorded media, the abstract structures, you know, that we call rhythm and harmony and meter, right? All of that which gives sound meaning. And so to explore that idea, that relationship between time and music and data, that was my mandate at a residency at IBeam. And so I started with this map again, right? And so my first step was to try to flip it into the temporal domain. And in thinking of how to do that, I ended up reducing all the points, you know, all this raw latitude and longitude data into this. So anytime I was in transition between two locations, that just became a vector. And I clustered the endpoints in order to identify kind of the habitual places in my life, right? So now we have what is basically just a directed graph of my movement in New York City. And then having identified these places, I took away that spatial representation. So each color here, this is a terrible visualization, but you know, each color identifies a different place, right? So you can see the weekly alternation between home and work, you know, these sections of 5 slices, and you know, the weekends are in there, and then these kind of bigger disruptions when I travel to other places. This is back when I had a real job. And then taking that strip, I was like, okay, you know, if we bend it around and try to make a clock out of it, what does that look like? So this is, if you think of midnight at the top and noon down at the bottom, this is maybe a month's worth of data, and you can see a rough divide between, you know, me hanging out at home and in my neighborhood and being out and about in the city. And then I was looking at this and I was thinking about, I should do something with music, and I have this kind of visualization. And then that was a bit of a revelation, and took on this aspect of old versus new media as well, right? So looking at the vinyl, I was like, okay, so 1 day of lived time can be 1 rotation of the platter. And then 1 rotation, at 33 and a third RPM is 1.8 seconds. And 365 rotations at 1.8 seconds is around 11 minutes, which is actually a decent amount of time for a side. So when the math totally worked out, I knew I had to do this. And luckily, I have this friend, Ted Reeder, who makes all sorts of custom vinyl, and he's put together a lathe. So we were able to try it out and see how things lined up. And as far as the music, I decided to map each city that I visited in that year to a musical key. And then each place, like each of those colors, maps to a musical interval, right? So basically, I ordered all the places in my life in terms of frequency. Home was the most common, followed by work, the studio, etc., right? And that ordering determined this interval. The exact interval was a compositional choice, but once I made that choice, it was consistent across all the cities. And in general, the more consonant intervals in this piece are the more common places. So there's a lot of major thirds for asleep at home in there. And then the deviation produces the jazz notes. And when I play it, you can listen to how it modulates when I go to a different city. Temporally, it's quantified to a grid, which is 2 hours of live time, or 150 milliseconds of music, depending on how you want to think of it, which is like 16th notes. And I have an algorithm that spreads out transitions that are faster than that, places that I'm at only briefly, so that everything gets represented. And we can discuss if you think that's cheating or not. And there's 2 voices, right? So one is this diurnal pulse. So it's a repeating figure over the 24 hours that lets you know where you are in a day, that provides a meter and a reference for what's happening. And then the main melody is driven by this location data. And all that's pretty minimal code-wise. It's a little over 100 lines of Python code, which then outputs MIDI. And that's kind of how I like to work, is to kind of give to the computer what is the computer's, and let the sound emerge from a table like this that's full of pedals and lo-fi synths and whatever else that I can take an improvisatory approach to coming up with a timbre. And there's a couple of open hardware meblip synths in there, which are like $40 and great, and that's kind of the bulk of the sound you'll hear. And then as a design object, the surface of the vinyl provided a nice dimensionality to the project, right? So we have a tactile interface that can also serve as a diagram of its time-based content. And I collaborated with the wonderful designer Greg Mihalko on this. And we came up with a minimal system in which the markings indicate a span of a year. So it's a 24-hour clock, runs in reverse, given the mechanics of the turntable. And the rings indicate the different cities that I visited that year. So you can select into them, the background space being New York City as a default. And there's the cover. So, of course, by inscribing this data on a vinyl record, it's also kind of self-consciously fetishistic, right? But the intention behind that is to highlight what is gained and lost in this translation between the lived process of creating the data, the mobile device that encoded it, my interpretive composition, these sounding devices, and then this precious physical object. And each of those translations, it leaves some kind of a trace, right? And it speaks to my specific experience, but also hopefully it allows this, to be understood in a variety of ways that are at least, a little different than maybe what Silicon Valley thinks my data should be about. And it became important to me further, that this was experienced in physical format, right? Like on the turntable. So, the listener places the stylus, navigates in, selecting, rewinding, even scratching it a bit. And so I hope that reinforces the idea that this is a retelling of the data each time, right? And I made 10 records, and as I've been exhibiting them, they kind of collect a history in their scratches, which is, an aspect that I love. They kind of become corrupted by their experience. Okay, so what you're about to hear, these are the motifs of my movements through the cities, repeating according to the habits, with some kind of variation. And I want to reemphasize that the intent here is to appeal to embodied rather than cogitated perception, right? This is meant to be felt as music is felt, not decoded in some way. So the aesthetic is a far cry from what I think is typical for data sonification, right? Which can be atonal and non-metric. And here I'm intentionally invoking 20th century minimalism, right? Steve Reich, even Laurie Spiegel. And I think there's a point to be made about the capacity of that idiom of music to represent data. And I'm not sure how Reich would feel about using data sets to drive processes, but we can think of the music of quotidian record as the process of data being enumerated and interpreted according to a set of rules, right? And so to address that idea of whether this is being true to the data or not or whatever, I think it is if it follows that simple guideline, right? Which is that things should have a one-to-one mapping strategy that stays constant over the course of the piece. And if all that's kind of a bit modernist, maybe that reflects the modernism of a database. But the important thing for me is that it's accessible and transparent. Because I'm making something explicit here that already exists implicitly, I would argue, in all music. And this is from Henri Lefebvre, who writes that musical rhythm has an ethical function. In its relation to the body, to time, to the work, it illustrates real, everyday life. And so he's claiming that the patterns of everyday life are inherently musical, right? And so understanding the world in terms of musical rhythm, I think, might be a kind of alternative data science, right? That's inherently relational. There's no absolute determinations, in music. It's always polyrhythms and meter and harmony. So we can start to talk about, what would it would be to be in sync with each other or experiencing dissonance, or we can think about how individuals might, literally have their own beats, or the same with cities, or maybe ecosystems. And we can talk about how then we tune those things, or maybe we want to resist that tuning. And so by working musically, I'm hoping to engage kind of embodied ways of hearing data, that bring to the foreground these sites of temporal politics, right? The collision, say, between natural social cycles and global capitalist clock time, and that's something you experience if you've ever woken up to an alarm clock. And this image should elicit kind of mixed emotions from anyone who took piano lessons as a child. And think about it as both a mechanism and a metaphor for the elevators and dinner tables and dance floors, meetings, emails, internets, whatever, with which we negotiate our time every day, and through which we live the fact that the everyday is political. So thinking about bodily rhythms, it seems to me that all human experience happens within a certain polyrhythmic pulse, right? There's this triple meter between our heartbeat, our breathing, and the cadence of our walking. And those three, I think, structure our perception of time, whatever other clocks and apps, et cetera, that we might come up with. And of course, we're not always walking, right? It could be about our pedaling. So for 6 years, I commuted between Brooklyn and Midtown. And before I moved to Providence, I wanted to produce some kind of documentation of that experience. It became very fundamental to how I understood the city. And video doesn't really capture it because that visuality is blind to my physical effort, as it encounters the rhythms of the city. And so I got sensors for my heart rate and for the pedals, and I made a really janky one for my breathing. And here's some of the data. So you've got heart rate versus cadence on top, just the shapes over the course of the whole ride. The heart rate is the red one because it doesn't stop. And the and the bottom is I was basically just recording the audio of my exhales and then doing a peak detection on top of that to capture the rhythm of the breath. And each of those biometric sources then dictates the timing of a voice in a minimalist composition. So the heart is pizzicato, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. The pedaling is bowed, and breathing is represented with the scraping on the strings of a viola or a cello. And then the harmonic material is just this chord cycle that follows my spatial progress through the city. It's not mapped to anything, it's just my interpretation of how this should feel. And then the musicians interpret each voice of the piece via this custom score display software that adapts to the irregular timing of that data. So I think of it, it's kind of like Guitar Hero for biometrics. And working with trained musicians rather than synthesized sounds on this one, it really excited me. Because it's actually hard for someone to play your heart rate for 40 minutes, right? It's pretty boring. There's a very real way that this gets revisceralized, right? There's a meaningful translation from a body to the data to another body. And this is maybe an obvious point, but if you think about the medium of a musical score and you think about it as data, with music, we already have myriad cultures and traditions for performing data. So this is an excerpt, and in this version is actually all the tracks are cello performed by Dopu Leo. so I've been experimenting with various ways, with how that kind of musicianship can be deployed. And I was commissioned to write a piece for the Quiet City Ensemble in New York. And I thought I'd use the opportunity to play with the black box data recovered from the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Tim Murray, from his car, which he crashed in the middle of the night. The governor was fine, I'm not sure how, but he lied about the incident. And so it was this minor controversy in New England, and the Boston Globe released the data set that ended up being in the middle of this controversy. And the governor claimed that he wasn't speeding, and that he was wearing a seatbelt, and he was just out surveying the road conditions at 3 a.m. But the data show that, in fact, he was not wearing his seatbelt, and he was traveling over 100 miles an hour when he steered directly into a rock wall. And so the title of the piece is called, "You'll Just Have to Take My Word for It." Because that's what the governor said when no one believed his explanation for why he was out that night. And all kinds of conspiracy theories, of course, and expert testimonies, right? They erupted online with their own interpretation of this data set. And so again, there's this interplay between the data and the narrative that can't totally be resolved. And so I decided to make a take on this. So I have two guitars, one of which plays a repeating figure that indicates the RPM of the engine, right? And the other for how far the governor has pressed down the gas pedal. And the saxophone plays an accelerometer in the car that was matched, pitch-wise to this chromatic blues scale. So then on the point of impact, I slow everything down so you can hear all the details of the car flipping through space in the form of a sax solo. And I'm not exactly sure what having this as a sax part does, but I wanted to see if arbitrary data would be meaningful to play. If I could make it meaningfully difficult to play, and just offer another interpretation of what the data is supposed to be about. And you can see the bit where the accelerometer starts to get kind of interesting. So I'm just going to jump right into the very end of this piece. So there you have that. I invited the governor to the performance of that, but he didn't show up, so I guess he wasn't into it. And that's Steve Lefou on saxophone, and the camera work on this is Jonathan Menard. Thank you for that. So another attempt is a collaboration with Sue Huang, with whom I've worked over the last 10 years under the moniker Knife and Fork. And we were recently commissioned to do a performance piece at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati. And just a quick aside to make a case for collaboration. So Sue is a wonderful artist and illustrator. She teaches at Smith, and we met during our master's degree. And we've never lived in the same city since then, but we come together maybe once a year to do a project. And even though we're both perhaps kind of introverted by nature, because there's two of us, our practice is necessarily based on these really intense conversations/arguments. And that intersubjective element between us in our process, I think results in concepts that involve public participation more, both in the literal sense and in the sense of welcoming participants to really determine whatever it is the piece is about. And that's been really instructive for me in my personal work as well. Because I think it's actually pretty hard to do that individually when you become attached to your private thinking. And having a collaborator that I trust has been an immensely valuable experience for me. So this building is a crazy space, right? It was designed by Zaha Hadid. It epitomizes a certain vision of what an institutional art space aspires to be, both architecturally and organizationally. And as we walked through that space, we thought about the public, moving through the exhibition, following the narrative script, that was laid out by the architect and then subsequently by the curator, that's intended to some extent to dictate the unfolding of time. And so we wanted to do something to resist that a bit, right? To frustrate it with some other kind of logic, some logic that had to do with networks or the internets or something. So we decided to work with the Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati to have a chamber ensemble perform Ravel's pictures at an exhibition, right? Which was originally written for promenading through a museum. But instead of having them sit together as an ensemble somewhere, we distributed them throughout the building. So whether that's a gallery like this, bassoonist is in, or the machine room upstairs that we convinced the poor trombonist to sit in. And so the musicians, they're all listening to a click track that's synchronized over the network. So we use Raspberry Pis for this. Each one has this little setup with headphones. And from a network perspective, they're organized in a hub. They're constantly syncing their time together. And that ends up working within, a couple of milliseconds. And the result is that each musician is playing kind of this lonely piece of the whole, right? So they're locked into this control mechanism of the click track, and they know that everyone else is out there somewhere, but they're kind of physically disassociated. And then for the audience, they're roaming around. They can hear maybe one or two instruments at a time, maybe three in one place, but they never get a cohesive sense of the music. And so the whole thing remains unresolved, right? The point is that these bodies have to negotiate, this disjuncture between space and time. So here's some pretty rough documentation it's put together.
Start down the wood shop.
Well, he's the beginning notes of the piece.
Yeah.
The trumpet. I'm gonna go there.
All right, I'll start down the bottom maybe.
All right, one final piece. In 1986, thanks, Diego Maradona was the greatest soccer player alive. And Argentina happened to be at war with England, and their teams met in the quarterfinals of the World Cup in Mexico City. And Maradona scores illegally with his hand. And the ref didn't see it, and the goal stood, so this became known as the Hand of God goal. Right? So Sue and I decided this would be fun to recreate at MoCA in LA. And although this work isn't explicitly musical, I still think of it as a composition, right, with theme and variations. Because we did it 64 times, each time with a different member of the public playing the role of Maradona. So we laid down AstroTurf in the middle of this museum, which was a real pain in the ass. But it doesn't take that much to transform a space. You know, we kind of had this fake goalpost here. We added some bleachers, and we enlisted a local semi-pro soccer team to fill out the players. And we marked up the choreography so people would know what they're doing. And there's Bobby, he's in our sky cam. We were trying to get the same angle as the original broadcast. And Enrique Gutierrez from Univision Sports announced it. So here's the original play. So he's totally faking this here.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Azteca Stadium in beautiful Mexico City for this quarterfinal match between Argentina and England. This is the 1986 FIFA World Cup, and here come the players. Argentina has the ball. Diego Armando Maradona looking to open the score, looking for Valdano. Valdano cannot control it. The ball goes back to Diego Maradona. Maradona goes for it. Goal, 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 goal. I cannot believe what I just saw. A handball. The referee is allowing the goal. Unbelievable. Argentina won. England nothing in this quarterfinal match of the 1986 FIFA World Cup. Diego Armando Maradona looking to make something happen. He's only scored one goal so far. Valdano. Touch misclears the ball. Diego Armando Maradona with his left hand. Gol, 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 gol. Argentina. Argentina won. England nothing. The referee. Touch defending Maradona. Maradona looking for Valdano. Finally clearing the ball into the stand. Just clearing the ball away from Diego looking for Valdano.
I'm sorry.
He apologizes for the bad pass. And now Maradona, unbelievable. The one-on-one versus finish. What a finishing touch by Diego Armando Maradona. This is unbelievable. Pay attention, Maradona. Dribbling down the middle, Maradona. The man look pass to Valdano. Here we go, Maradona. The one-year-old Maradona. Oh! He's a missile. And now he scores. Diego Armando Maradona. Gol, 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 gol. Gol!
So the point is to take this iconic, sports moment that's been immortalized in media, it's replayed over and over again, and to reanimate it, right? To make it present. And we structured the setup, based upon these kind of particular parameters from the original. But the participants, they're retelling it in their own ways and making stories from it, new variations, hopefully not injuring their children. There's a point at this event where I was just sitting in the bleachers, right, and just observing and surprised as anyone, at what was unfolding in front of me, and that was kind of a rare victory for me. I felt good about that because I was able to let go, and the theme of the work there, the theme of the process, which is whatever we think something should be, what we think it should be about, that we leave enough of a gap open that it can take on its own life. Right, so again, there's that transference we're hoping to point to when the mediatized history, the history of representation, of data, it necessarily becomes transmuted into this oral history, or in this case, a kind of kinetic history, right? A kinetic storytelling when you put it back into time. And that is to say that our experience of following the line is our own reducible subjective experience. And here's some of what I'd like to go to next, right? It has to do with maybe coal and ducks and cyborgs and boxing and anthracite and stupas and war and Python 3 and whatever. But I also just want to become a better listener. And, ultimately, I'm trying to get at something that perhaps, consists nothing more of these intuitive truths that we have about rhythm, right? And the rhythms of everyday life and how they are culturally understood. But there remains something deeply unsatisfying and awkward, right, about how we tend to talk about data and how we place data in time, which is wonderful and dangerous and which has very real implications, but which I think can be approached poetically. And so I hope these projects serve as both metaphors and, as some small mechanisms to point at that. And that new approaches to music, might be some reminder that there's more than one way to interpret a score.